This video is about Sri Lanka's colonial experience, under the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the British. As context, when I visited the island it was going through a deep financial crisis and there were nationwide protests against the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, known as Gota. You will see his name pop up throughout the video. During these videos, I'm going to be telling two stories. The history of the island and how that led to where it is now, alongside the story of my own travels in Sri Lanka in July and August 2022. In Lisbon, the 15th century was a period of frantic exploration, and from their perch on the east of Europe, the Portuguese were soon sending navigators off in all directions. By the end of the century, they had reached Brazil and the Cape of Good Hope. In 1497, Vasco da Gama reached India. 8 years later, the Portuguese reached the island of Ceylon. The Portuguese were mainly interested in trade, much more than having a colony where they would send their own people, and their interest in Sri Lanka was about one thing above all else: cinnamon. Cinnamon, which you probably already know as a flavor, is a type of tree bark. It used to be so highly prized that it was gifted to kings and queens, and throughout the Middle Ages the source was kept a secret from Europeans. Importantly, it took a long time for people to learn how to cultivate it, so during most of the colonial period it had to be harvested from its natural environment, and Sri Lanka's cinnamon was the finest in the world. Now, when the Portuguese first arrived, the island was actually quite fractured, and they were all fighting each other. You had the Jaffna Kingdom of Tamils in the north, then you had the Kingdom of Kandy, and various other Sinhalese kingdoms. The Portuguese were actually invited into the island's politics by the Kandians, who needed an ally against their enemies, the Sitawaka Kingdom. The Portuguese fought one group of Sinhalese, then fought the Kandians for a bit, but the Kandians had moved their capital up into the thickly forested central mountains, which were perfect for defense. Eventually, the Portuguese controlled a substantial portion of the island, but never all of it. The Kandians were the holdouts. They established a sort of uneasy peace in which the Kandians would pay tribute to the Portuguese. The Portuguese weren't so popular. They converted quite a few people to Catholicism and persecuted the Muslims, who had already been there for a few centuries themselves in small coastal communities. They destroyed huge numbers of Hindu and Buddhist temples and plundered their treasures. This religious intolerance was a new thing on the island, as both the Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms had traditionally been quite religiously tolerant. The Portuguese also took the tooth relic, which was believed to be the actual tooth of the Buddha himself, to Goa in India, where they apparently pounded it to dust and burnt it, though according to Buddhists, it reconstituted itself and flew back to the island. Even despite being massive assholes, they actually converted a lot of the coastal communities to Christianity, both Tamils and Sinhalese. And there are still a large numbers of Catholics in Sri Lanka, as well as a large number of Sri Lankans who have names like De Silva, Fonseca, Pereira, and Don Carolus. It's actually pretty remarkable that the Portuguese were able to do what they did, not just in Sri Lanka, but in Goa, in the Malabar Islands, in Mozambique, and in Brazil. The home country had a population of just a little over 1 million, and at any given time they had maybe 6,000 to 7,000 native-born Portuguese available to serve in their entire Asian empire. On one expedition they tried to put down the Kandians with a force of just 1,000 Portuguese troops. So the Portuguese only rarely controlled the Jaffna and Cote kingdoms for 40 and 60 years respectively, and their control was never really that strong. They maintained the same ruling structure that they found and just sat on top of it. Next arrived the Dutch, or more specifically, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, a multinational corporation. And I mean that it was literally a corporation, which created the world's first private empire. The Kandians appealed to the Dutch for help, who then booted out the Portuguese. Their interest, again, was trade, and, just like the Portuguese, they could never control the whole island, though they now controlled the entire coastline. Though there was an uneasy truce between them and the Kandians, resistance to the Dutch never really went away. By surviving and staying independent, the Kingdom of Kandy provided a continuity in terms of political institutions, traditions, and religion, with the Sinhalese kingdoms going all the way back to Anuradhapura, the civilization that we looked at in the previous video. However, let's not idealize these Kandians. It was a feudal monarchy in which all rights originated in the king. They had a much stricter caste system than down on the coasts, a system in which you were born to do one role only, and your job was to provide only that type of labor. You could only marry within your caste, or maybe subcaste. Caste determined who you could even talk to, and if your caste was on the bottom of the hierarchy, then too bad. Things were actually much more relaxed under European rule, even if the Europeans did, in some respects, cement some caste obligations like those of the cinnamon peelers. The Dutch needed the Kandians, and the Kandians needed the Dutch. The Kandian king was needed to give consent for the caste of cinnamon peelers to peel their cinnamon, which the Dutch needed to export to make money. Meanwhile, the Kandians, because they were the only royal ruling family on the island, had to get their spouses from the royal families in South India. The Kandians didn't have any great ships or ports, so the Dutch would transport the Kandians over to India and then come back with the brides. It was only through Dutch ships that the Kandians could keep contact with the Buddhist states of Southeast Asia, especially Burma and Thailand, which they needed to keep rejuvenating their Buddhist traditions and hierarchy. And so like that, they made it work for a couple of hundred years. The Dutch impact is less visible than the Portuguese, even though they were there for much longer. Like the Portuguese, they took over the existing native administration and left it pretty much as they found it. Though they encouraged conversion to Calvinism, they didn't make religion a big priority. They were there as businessmen. Their religion, Calvinism, didn't really survive long after they left, though there are still some Dutch words in Sinhalese and Tamil, and some mixed-race Sri Lankans called burghers. Perhaps the most important changes were legal, with the strengthening of the institutions of marriage and monogamy, and of private property, as opposed to the collective ownership at the village level of the past. The most visible manifestation of the Dutch presence is the huge fort at Galle down on the south coast, and it was there that I was heading to next. I passed the tuk-tuks lined up to get the fuel that was being strictly rationed on account of the financial crisis. The rest of Colombo was on its way to work. There's something I've always loved about train travel. It's a bit strange, but I enjoy being able to peep into people's backyards, just for a second. They know you're doing it. After all, they live next to a train track. But there's something so charming about glimpsing each of these tiny little kingdoms. Each one the stage where a life is lived, and each yard shaped and taken care of. They just keep coming past the open door of the train. The world is such a detailed place. My journey to Galle was broken up by Hikkaduwa, a quiet beach town, like many strung out along the coast. Outside my guest house, coconut lay drying in the sun. Hikkaduwa used to be a mecca for hippies back in the 1970s. But it's since fallen off the tourist trail a little bit, and now seems to cater mainly to Russians. The most authentic part of the town might be the port, although I had missed the day's catch. It was hard to find anywhere open, either because of the crisis or because it wasn't high season in this part of the country. The town might not be very authentic, but the fish is fresh and good and cheap. It wasn't a bad place to get some work done. So we left the story with the Dutch, who controlled Sri Lanka for about 200 years. Next came the British, who moved in at the end of the 18th century while the Netherlands had been invaded by the French during the French Revolutionary Wars. The British arrived first on the coast and then finally signed a treaty absorbing the Kingdom of Kandy in 1815, that remaining Sinhalese kingdom in the centre of the island that the Dutch and Portuguese had never been able to conquer. Now, all of the island was finally under the control of a colonial power. And it was the first time since the 11th century, or depending on who you read, the first time ever, that the entire island had been properly united. One of the staggering facts about Britain's empire is just how small the imperial part of it was. Even at the height of the colony, there were never more than 6,000 Britons living in Sri Lanka. For comparison, today, there are around 8,000 Sri Lankans just in Tooting, one part of London, and well over 100,000 throughout the UK. So this new colony was called British Ceylon. Ceylon is what Sri Lanka was called until 1972. Technically, I probably should have been calling it Ceylon throughout this video and the previous one, but I didn't want it to be more confusing than I had to be. Now, the big discovery of the British was that, in addition to growing cinnamon, Sri Lankan's highlands were perfect for growing coffee, tea, and rubber. For this purpose, the British brought hundreds of thousands of Tamil workers from South India to work as indentured labourers on the plantations. The workers were marched into the jungle, which they then had to clear and cultivate. Almost a third of them died from malaria and exhaustion on the way to work, but they kept coming, more than 1 million in the end. Soon these plantation Tamils alone had grown to 10% of the island's population, and by the start of the 20th century their numbers equaled those of the longer standing Sri Lankan Tamils. A reminder that these plantation Tamils can be considered a separate group from the Sri Lankan Tamils. For one thing, they are mostly a different caste called Sudra, which is at the very bottom of the caste hierarchy. In the island's modern history, there is probably no group that has been more discriminated against. Despite their numbers, at no point have they played a very active role in the island's politics. That is how disempowered they have been. Historically, they have very much been looked down on by the Tamils of the north and east. Anyway, tea was perfect for Ceylon. It thrived in Sri Lanka, and Ceylon tea became famous around the world, and still is. Though the British didn't persecute Hindus and Buddhists, they also didn't allow them to run schools and put barriers in the way of them building new temples. In contrast, Christian schools were funded and privileged, and though the state was officially neutral, there were plenty of unofficial ways that the spread of Christianity was encouraged. The British ruled through a traditional elite whose authority reached down into the villages. This traditional elite was a counterweight to the newly educated elite that had risen as the economy of the island developed, and who were demanding more of a share of power in the colony. These were often self-made men and spoke English, often as a first language, and they were direct competitors of the old hereditary elite. This competition formed a bond between the government, run by the British, and the traditional elite. While at first the British had accepted caste, and then for a while discouraged it, now they fully went along with caste privileges to maintain the stability of the system. This encouraged friction and competition between castes and impeded a sense of unity amongst the Senegalese. So the British were running this thing. But we shouldn't imagine legions of white British people descending on the island. There were businessmen that came to set up plantations, of course, but there weren't so many. The vast majority of the governing structure was staffed by Sri Lankans. However, there was a limit to how high a native could climb, and the higher levels of the civil service remained purely European, despite there now being generations of English first language Sri Lankans with real English educations, who in their class and custom had really bought into the whole English thing. In fact, I would go further to say that that class of people still absolutely exists in Sri Lanka today. And I met a number of people on my travels that went to old traditional schools with names like St. Joseph's and St. Thomas's, who speak with, to my ear, posh English accents and play rugby and cricket and drink beer, all quintessential English things. They remain the upper crust of Sri Lankan society. So British Ceylon was buzzing from its thriving plantation economy as well as its strategic position on the sea routes. The country was stitched together with a modern rail network. Though most of the plantation economy was owned by Europeans, a new class of Sinhalese entrepreneurs grew up, and some measure of newfound prosperity did extend to nearly all classes of people, including in rural areas. The island's standard of living was well ahead of the rest of South Asia, and most of Southeast Asia as well, except for Singapore. However, in much of the rural areas in the dry zone, life was still very hard indeed. Crops would often fail for lack of rain, and there would often be famine or near famine. The end of British rule was actually fairly democratic. From 1909 there was a partly elected assembly, and in 1931 Sri Lanka effectively had self-rule, with elections with universal suffrage. Sri Lanka was the first Asian country of any type, colonized or not, to have universal suffrage, and that was while it was still a British colony. For comparison's sake, Australia only gave the vote to all Indigenous Australians in 1967, and Switzerland only gave women the vote in 1971. Independence was delayed by World War II, when Sri Lanka was the headquarters of the Eastern Theatre and the Japanese Navy bombed it in 1942. There isn't actually much to report about Sri Lanka's independence movement because it all went so smoothly. Sri Lanka was gradually and mostly peacefully steered towards self-rule by this English-speaking, non-nationalist elite who the British trusted. There was no mass movement agitating for independence. The most important thing, however, is that in these earlier elections, when ordinary people were given a vote, they immediately voted along ethnic lines. Democracy meant that, instead of an equal balance, independence would mean that the fate of the minorities now rested permanently with the Sinhalese majority. The hope was that a new politics could mature and orient itself around competing political ideas rather than race and religion, and it would do that before they got independence. That didn't happen. When I got to Hikkaduwa bus station the next morning, I found an anti-government protest. Also, all the buses were cancelled for lack of fuel. They told me it was by the order of the government. Luckily, the next train was arriving just moments after. It was a lovely sunny day, and little did I know it would be one of the most important days in Sri Lanka's recent history. I was going to Galle to watch a game of cricket, and outside the ground I was met with another demonstration. They were protesting against the president, who they wanted to step down. It looked like this fellow was reading his supermarket receipt. up on the old walls of the giant Dutch fort as well. The thing was about these protests is that while the protesters were furious, there wasn't even a suggestion of physical violence in the air, at least down here in Galle. They were perfectly welcoming to me as a foreigner. In fact, many people told me they wanted me to show the world what was happening in Sri Lanka. You can even see this sign, thanking the Australian cricket team for the global spotlight they were putting on the protests. I went to my guest house where they were showing the news. In Colombo, things had exploded. News was breaking that protesters had entered the presidential compound and were playing in his pool.
They blame Gotabaya Rajapaksa for an economic crisis that's made life unbearable for many of the country's 22 million people. They called Saturday D-Day. The demonstrators stormed into the president's official residence in Colombo.
That night, the news broke. The president would step down.
Sri Lanka's president has agreed to resign after protesters stormed the presidential palace.
The moment the dam broke.
From the morning, clashes between protesters.
One police officer calmly rode up, parked up, joining the protests, which looked today like revolution.
Undeterred by tear gas.
Gotabaya Rajapaksa hanged in effigy in the streets.
The demonstrators stormed into the president's official residence in Colombo.
Security forces were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers.
And they swarmed into the office of a president already fled.
Inside, this is what it looked like.
Partying among the bedrooms, personal medication and a cotton bud, together with, yes, the presidential underpants.
While a few jumped in the swimming pool.
Filming a fleet of luxury cars the president will not now be taking for a spin.
Thousands come here to see how Gotabaya Rajapaksa lived in luxury.
And don't forget the kitchen, snacking and necking the presidential booze.
The president was moved by his security team to an undisclosed location.
So it looks like the end of the Rajapaksa family dynasty and the long years of complete control it exercised.
The deep-rooted economic problems have remained unaddressed for decades, and the Rajapaksa government's mismanaged economic policies has left the country virtually bankrupt. It's ordinary Sri Lankans who will have to bear the brunt of the worst man-made disaster the country is facing.
What would come next? We will continue the story in the next video, as well as look at the modern origins of the ethnic conflict which would soon tear Sri Lanka apart.
In this war without rules or compassion, few prisoners are taken.
They are committed and prepared to die fighting or commit suicide for the cause by biting a cyanide capsule they wear around their necks.